Layer 2s have amassed close to $10 billion in total value locked to date, and are currently seeing more TPS than Ethereum. But what are Layer 2s, and how decentralized are they? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about. What a Layer 2 is, why they're needed, how decentralized they actually are, and of course, my thoughts on the matter. This is a very loaded topic that we're jumping into today, so I hope that you can learn just a little bit from it. That being said, very quick disclaimer before jumping in. I do community strategy at Off-Chain Labs, the team that initially built Arbitrum. So do please be aware that there may be a little bit of an obvious bias. But I'll do my best to try to remain as neutral as possible. That being said, let's get into it. So what is a layer 2? Well, taking the definition from ethereum.com directly, a layer 2 is a separate blockchain that extends Ethereum and inherits the security guarantees of Ethereum. So in my words, this essentially means that layer 2s do not have their own method of consensus, like proof of stake or proof of work. They use Ethereum's proof of stake consensus mechanism. So an Arbitrum, an Optimism, a zkSync, etc., they don't have, they're not POS, they're not POW, they're not any of that. They take Ethereum's proof of stake consensus mechanism and leverage that. At least that's kind of the whole point of what a layer 2 is supposed to be. Couple notes here though, couple caveats. Once upon a time, Polygon's main chain, Polygon POS, was marketed as a layer 2. Some of you guys may still be calling it a layer 2. However, for a while now, the community has already kind of agreed as a whole that it's simply just not a layer 2, and just really based off of that simple definition I mentioned earlier. It does not inherit the security of Ethereum, so therefore it's not a layer 2. It's more of a side chain, I guess you could call it. Which is really, it actually is a side chain, to be honest with you. Additionally, we will also be talking about solutions that store data off-chain, such as optimistic chains, Anytrust chains, and Validiums. These are all arguably things that can or cannot be considered layer 2s. There isn't really a consensus on what the community considers them yet, so just for the sake of providing more content and more education, I'll be including them in today's video just so you get an understanding of why they're different. Just generally, I think we can start off with categorizing scaling solutions first by optimistic and zk, and then from there differentiating by how that data is stored, as I just mentioned. So for a quick refresher, for those of you who don't know, optimistic rollups will essentially assume that transactions posted from L2 to L1 are correct unless someone challenges it. Whereas zk rollups uses cryptography to prove that everything being posted from L2 to L1 is correct. To be clear, there is no technical right approach. It's really just different ways of scaling Ethereum. That being said, though, as it stands today, optimistic rollups are far more advanced and optimized, I should say, than zk rollups. So with that, let's jump into optimistic rollups first. So we have Arbitrum 1 and Optimism are the two biggest ones, currently that are live. There are actually quite a few more in production that people are using, such as Base or a Boba network that are actually based on Optimism's code base, but none else that have created their own architecture from the ground up. One important caveat that I think should be mentioned here is that per the definition of an L2, any team, including Optimism, that's using Optimism's architecture can't technically be considered an optimistic rollup because their system does not have a way to detect and challenge fraudulent transactions from being posted back to Ethereum. TLDR, they don't have fraud proofs. Their team does say it's in development and are even looking to support zk proofs, but they're not there yet. As for Arbitrum, fraud proofs are live and functioning, but are currently behind a whitelist. Off-Chain Labs, the team that I'm part of, did recently release Bold, which is essentially a way to safely enable permissionless fraud proofs for Arbitrum-based rollups. However, to be clear, that upgrade will require the Arbitrum DAO's approval for it to be live on Arbitrum 1. And again, TLDR, Arbitrum is the only optimistic rollup with fraud proofs live today, but in a permissioned state. So I think two important caveats that I think should really make sure that you guys know. There's a couple other things that we'll talk about from a security perspective later on in the video, but let's move on to zk stuff. For zk rollups, there are two main approaches, at least that I've seen, for how some teams have chosen to go about them. And the main thing is either posting raw transaction data, which is the call data and the output of a transaction on Ethereum, or posting state diffs, which essentially is posting the difference or the change of state on a chain instead of posting the actual transactions themselves. There's pros and cons to doing either or. State diffs I think tend to be cheaper, but I think there is some sort of like security trade-off there. Don't need to get too deep there, but the point is that there are a couple zk rollups, and a lot more teams that are launching nowadays are choosing to go the zk route. But there's DYDX, which is an app-specific chain, and you have the generic ones that are like zkSync Era, Starknet, Polygon ZK EVM, Linea, just a couple names to just name a few. Definitely one thing to be clear, all of them, to my understanding, have ZK and validity proofs enabled. Let's move on to the scaling solutions that store data off-chain, as I mentioned earlier. So they're optimistic chains, which at least that's what L2B calls them. I don't think there's really a consensus yet on like what the community is calling these types of chains. But there's Arbitrum Nova, which is kind of a flavor of that, which I mentioned earlier are called Anytrust chains. And there's also Metis, which is essentially an optimism kind of fork, but they post data to just a different chain, at least to my understanding. Then of course you have Validiums, which are essentially based off of zk rollups, and some examples of those are Immutable X and SoRare. So there are four main types of, I guess you could call them L2s. As I mentioned, optimistic rollups, zk rollups, optimistic chains, and Validiums. Again, those last two, technically you can argue that they are L2s, they're not L2s, but again, for sake of the video, I'm just going to include them so that you guys have an idea of the differences. The other important thing to keep in mind is that the scaling solutions with data stored on-chain will always be a little more expensive than those with off-chain storage, and it's simply because the cost of posting batches of transactions to Ethereum versus a data availability committee, which is what the off-chain solutions tend to do, tend to be a lot higher to post on Ethereum, of course, which again the user will inevitably end up paying for. But yeah, TLDR, the whole point of that is if you want security, you have to pay for it. There really is no other way around it, to be honest with you. One important thing to note is that not every system is created equally. Some systems like Arbitrum 1 allow for seamless deployment of Solidity-based smart contracts, just like you would on Ethereum, for example, where others don't. And some, as you can see on L2B, are still quite far away from being technically mature. It's a great website for learning more about rollups and layer 2s and stuff like that. But the point is that not every optimistic rollup is the same, and not every zk rollup is the same. So now that you know the landscape of layer 2s for the most part, why are they needed? Just generally, like, what's the point? Well, tons of other blockchains are out there, as you guys know, like Avalanche, Solana, and name any other kind of L1 that you like. Why would someone want to use a blockchain on top of another blockchain? Sounds a little bit redundant, to be honest. Well, obviously, gas fees on Ethereum, of course, tend to be pretty high during bull season, and even just generally, they tend to be pretty high, which also causes transactions to finalize forever, right? So you have two pretty annoying things: slow transactions and very high fees. But what you get with L2s that you don't get on L1s are, number one, instantaneous confirmation. When I say confirmation, I'm saying like, you submit the transaction and it actually goes through visibly. That is literally instant. If you've never used an L2 before, I'm telling you, try it out. Doesn't matter if it's Arbitrum, Optimism, or any other flavor of that. And then of course the other obvious thing is that you're inheriting the security of Ethereum. That's the whole point of being a layer 2, is that you're not creating your own mechanism to come to consensus. You're relying on Ethereum for that. And again, the big asterisk here is that this is assuming that you're using a system, or you're using a layer 2 that has a system in place to prevent fraud, such as fraud proofs if it's an optimistic rollup, or validity proofs, or zk proofs, or whatever, if it's a zk rollup. And just generally, there's a huge demand for a chain that you can trust and will be there for a long time, of course, in this case, years to come. And I think most people have already agreed that Ethereum is that chain. So that, essentially what's left to build are these solutions that allow it to scale immensely on top of that already trusted layer. At least that's kind of my take personally. So are L2s decentralized? Well, let's go ahead and count out the optimistic chains and the Validiums. Those already require us to trust some other party to store data off-chain, so we're not even going to talk about them. But that leaves us with optimistic rollups and zk rollups. So to understand how decentralized these rollups are currently, we need to understand at a very high level the main components of these rollups. Two to be specific. Number one, the sequencer. A sequencer essentially is a node with limited power to control the ordering of transactions. In the Arbitrum system, it's first in, first out. And I think it's mostly the same thing for other systems. So as soon as you send a transaction in, the transaction will essentially be processed out. There's no mempool like there is on Ethereum, so you're not really waiting for someone to pick up the transaction. So there are no kind of priority fees or anything like that. But one thing that obviously should be known is that, let's say a sequencer, if it were to be malicious, technically it could front run your transactions. Number two, validators. This is going to be a little different, actually a lot different than the regular validator terminology you're used to on a proof of stake chain. A validator, again, we're going to use the Arbitrum system as an example, is a node that is able to either propose blocks, challenge blocks that are other validators propose, or simply watch blocks being proposed in the off chance that a malicious one is put forth. And to be clear, you're not looking at transactions as they come through and signing off of them. Again, that's what a proof of stake system would have a validator do. But remember, this is an L2, and L2s use Ethereum's consensus. So in this case, a validator is actually doing one of these three different things, and it's really just proposing blocks from L2 to L1, challenging blocks that other validators propose, or, as I mentioned, watching for any potential malicious ones. So there's three types there. But that's kind of how it works on the Arbitrum level. Again, optimisms may work differently, and for the zk side, definitely works a lot differently than that. So essentially, the end game for these two components are, one, for the sequencer, is decentralized sequencing, which, if you ask me, is a much hotter topic than it really needs to be, personally, since it has no impact on the trust or liveness aspects of a rollup. Rather, it kind of just allows multiple parties to potentially run sequencers instead of just one. But that being said, it has its own downfalls, decentralized sequencing, that is, depending on how it's implemented. But that's, in many people's eyes, kind of the end goal for sequencing. Whereas for fraud proofs, permissionless fraud proofs is the end goal there. And that's actually something every optimistic system should have. And then for zk rollups or validity proofs, the idea is for the average user to be able to generate validity proofs with a simple GPU, versus, I think the way it works right now is you have very, very expensive hardware, specialized equipment to be able to do, be able to essentially generate these proofs. That is essentially just a ton of cryptography. So that's kind of the idea for the end game of those two components, and kind of the main arguments that people have for that. And before I go into my thoughts, I do want to touch on one of the other obvious things, is that most L2s, actually I think all L2s, do have multisigs in place. A common argument that people have is, if there's a multisig in place, do proofs even matter? Well, the obvious answer is yes. Because by having a system built, you're credibly a lot closer to removing that potential multisig and moving further along that scale of decentralization, versus having nothing built, because there's no saying how long it may take to develop such a complex system. Again, in this case, we'll just talk about optimistic rollups here, and fraud proofs. Again, there's no saying how long it'll take to develop such a system, and then even after that, feeling comfortable enough to actually remove said multisig, or give the DAO the ability to remove the multisig, in which case the Arbitrum DAO does have the ability to remove the Security Council's ability to upgrade immediately. That being said, what do I think about all this stuff? I know it's been really long so far, so I'll try not to keep it too long, but I do have three main things. Number one, I've heard the argument that L2s are worse UX than L1s are. They're too complex to understand. I'd actually agree just a little bit that the systems definitely feel very complex, because I think for a lot of people it's I think most people kind of get the idea of a blockchain, but when they think about L2s, it's this whole kind of new topic. And the fact that the wording still isn't fully down, I think I get it. I can get why it's confusing for the average layman. But if you ask me, I think UX-wise and actually onboarding-wise, it's actually a lot better than most L1s. And I'll tell you why. Number one, some of the biggest L2s already, again, we'll take Arbitrum, have onboarding and offboarding on all major centralized exchanges. So, in terms of UX, you're literally able to, use your favorite exchange essentially and offboard and onboard, as you will. Unless you live in New York, then you're like me and you're screwed. Which also, by the way, gets rid of that 7-day waiting period if you're a user. You really don't have to do that anymore, because obviously, again, there's exchanges, there's fast bridges, a ton of them, that I'm sure you've probably used already if you're an avid crypto user. And let's obviously not forget that the sequencer obviously provides the ability for really instant, essentially, confirmation times for your transactions. So to me, it's honestly a no-brainer why you're even seeing now nowadays a good amount of L1s converting to L2s, just because it seems like that's honestly going to be the future. Optimistic or zk, that is. Yeah, and then, touching on that, will zk rollups win? I hear people saying that all the time. If you ask me, like, if you think optimistic rollups are complicated, like, zk rollups, to my understanding, are a whole other level. Like, as I mentioned earlier, very high proving costs that need to be essentially done every time a batch is posted. Whereas for optimistic rollups, you're only technically, fraud proofs are only technically being, are only happening if someone posts something fraudulent or someone thinks someone else posted something fraudulent, which in theory should never happen because the incentive is not to. Teams obviously are working to solve these high proving costs that zk rollups have, but I think it'll be some time. So if you ask me, for now and for the foreseeable future, optimistic rollups are the king. It's just how it is. I mean, look at L2 beat, and you can see it for yourself. That being said, last thing, I don't think a lot of these things that people talk about are as big of a deal as they think. I mentioned earlier decentralized sequencing. The truth is, the sequencer sounds like this big, bad, and scary thing, but in reality, like, permissionless fraud proofs and validation is heaps more important, but no one talks about it, right? If you do want more information on all the L2s that I provided, make sure to check out L2beat.com. Those guys provide a ton of information about L2s, and they're all actually, for the most part, I would argue, very, unbiased. But let me know in the comments below. If you're a fan of L2s, if you're not a fan of L2s, why not? Appreciate you guys for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.